honor now to present to you our paper on strategic non-disclosure and market feedback. So that's a little bit of a background because, yeah, the audience here is quite diverse. So I think let me first elaborate a bit about what this paper will be about. So there's growing evidence, and this has been coined the feedback literature, where information aggregated in financial markets and is reflected in prices, and managers take this into consideration when making future investment decisions. So one standard paper shows that, okay, managers alter their M&A decisions upon the announcement of M&A intentions, right? And recently, there has been growing interest in considering, okay, what affects this feedback mechanism from the market. And when we think about it, voluntary disclosure is a valid candidate here, right? So by disclosing some type of information, the manager essentially changes the trader's information acquisition and trading strategies. And because the market price aggregates those various sources of information from market participants, the information reflected in market prices may be informative for managers. So there's a way that, you know, the manager may be using her voluntary disclosure choices to affect the informativeness of market prices, and therefore change the information content for her and to change subsequently real investment decisions. And in fact, there's those three papers at least that look at managerial CapEx guidance as a voluntary disclosure mechanism, voluntary disclosure item that stimulates this feedback mechanism. So essentially, this uncovered a new disclosure motive, right? There are a lot of disclosure motives out there in the literature. Now, this very recent literature documented that managers may want to stimulate market feedback by disclosing CapEx guidance. And the way how it works is also very intuitive, right? A manager goes out and says, well, we're going to spend 500 million on CapEx next year, right? We're going to invest in this specific region. We're going to grow into that segment. And the market reaction upon that announcement tells the manager whether the market perceives this as a good or a bad idea, right? And what these papers have shown, very roughly speaking, the manager takes this into account and increases the CapEx scale if the feedback is positive. However, when we look at the data on CapEx disclosing firms, we see that, well, non-disclosure is way more prevalent. So depending on how you measure non-disclosure, quarter on the year level, you see that 60 to 80% of observations in standard data sets of firm year or firm quarter observations are non-disclosure observations. And when you now dive more into those non-disclosing firms, it seems to be the case that not all of them are routinely non-disclosures, right? That they never disclose any CapEx guidance, but it seems that they are some strategic consideration going on. Some quarter they are disclosing CapEx guidance, in others they don't. So potentially, this firm discloses or withholds that type of information. Now, when we think about strategic disclosure decision and in particular strategic non-disclosure, the fact that a firm strategically withholds information is itself information, right? And there's a large literature, but also empirical literature that studies the information content of strategic non-disclosure. However, all is about evaluation motive of disclosure. So if you are familiar with the standard disclosure literature, the standard phrase here is no news is bad news, right? The fact that a firm is not disclosing information may be driven by the firm trying to hide bad information, and because investors are not fooled by this strategic non-disclosure, they perceive a strategically non-disclosing firms to have bad information behind. However, this has not been tested or investigated properly for feedback intended disclosure items, and this is what we will do. And of course, this will be a bit more challenging because evaluation motive is very well understood, while this feedback stimulating motive of disclosure is not as much. So I've been talking a lot about strategic non-disclosure. So what do we really mean? I mean, theoretically, this is very well defined, right? A firm makes a deliberate choice to disclose or not. So any non-disclosure that follows will be strategic. Empirically, that's substantially harder to call a firm a strategically withholding firm. What are we going to do here? We try to measure the market's expectation of a firm providing disclosure. And we will call a firm that is unanticipated or unexpectedly withholding information as a strategic non-disclosing firm. So what we will do in this paper the whole time, we're going to focus on the non-disclosing firms and compare outcomes between a non-disclosing firm where the market was expecting a disclosure to occur with a routinely non-disclosing firm. So we really try to capture this informational content of non-disclosure in our paper. Two things. One is we're going to investigate what we call the market view. So what are the capital market effects upon strategic non-disclosure? We show that, well, this is not associated with lower abnormal returns. Again, coming back to the standard disclosure theory, where no news is bad news, you would expect substantially worse abnormal returns, for instance, for firms that strategically withhold information. But we don't find this. We don't find any significant differences between abnormal returns of strategically and routinely withholding firms, at least in terms of CapEx guidance. And this is at odds with, for instance, earnings guidance. So CapEx guidance is really something else than earnings guidance. However, we still show that there is an effect. We find that strategically withholding firms have substantially lower informed trading measures in their stock prices than routinely withholding firms. And that will then also motivate our second big investigation about what we call the firm view. Here, we're going to consider the withholding firms themselves and investigate their real decision-making. Because recall, the feedback effect is really about the firm learning from the market and changing their real decisions, for instance, investment making. So here, we're going to investigate also the firm view, how those strategically non-disclosing firms differ from routinely withholding firms. And what do we find? Well, we document a weaker feedback channel. So we document that strategically withholding firms are associated with lower sensitivity of investment to own stock price valuation, which means essentially that those firms tend, or at least can be perceived to be learning less from the market. However, we document that those strategically withholding firms have a stronger dependence on alternative signals. So they have higher sensitivity of future investment to current cash flows and higher sensitivity of future investment to the disclosing peers valuation, which implies that those strategically withholding firms seem to use alternative information sources rather than their information incorporated in their own stock price. All right, so let's go into the details here of our paper. We're going to focus on what is, quote unquote, feedback stimulating disclosure. So we're going to focus on the voluntary CapEx guide. We focus on firm quarter level, of CapEx non-guidance firms. And we consider annual CapEx guidance, which corresponds to the forecasting year, which is the same definition as by Bay. And we're going to identify firms, non-disclosing firms, by whenever there's no CapEx guidance in a given quarter in the IBIS dataset. Our focus is on US CompuStat universal firms between 2004 and 19. And in addition to CompuStat and IBIS, we also use CRISP as standard data sources. As a bit of summary statistics here, CapEx guidance decisions is the key. So if a firm, for all firms that now in a given quarter provide CapEx guidance, 41% of those firms also provide disclosure in the next quarter. So there is some stickiness, however, not a perfect one. In addition, there's a lot of cross-sector variation. So disclosure decisions differ significantly in the industry and in firm characteristics that are associated with disclosure. So for instance, if a firm is more CapEx intense, there is more to report if you wish, and those type of firms also have a higher likelihood to provide disclosure. Similarly, larger firms generally have a better information environment and also disclose more frequently. And also we have a peer dimension where if a given firm's peers disclose, then the focal firm is also more likely to provide disclosure. So our main empirical strategy is to identify strategically non-disclosing firms, and as I already alluded to, that's tough to do as an empirical researcher, right? So what we do is to try to identify unanticipated non-disclosures, which we will then, quote unquote, label strategic non-disclosing firms. So we'll use two disclosure expectation proxies, which arguably the market may form himself. So as I've mentioned, disclosure patterns are sticky, are persistent. So we're gonna first construct what we call CapEx disclosure history, which is the percentage of past quarters with a firm provided CapEx disclosure prediction model, so logit model, and the variable we call CapEx disclosure prediction, where we predict the likelihood that a given firm is providing disclosure in a given quarter based on standard firm characteristics associated with the disclosure process. And here, just as a little remark, is the outcome of the prediction model in a nutshell. So you see that the non-disclosing firm quarter have a mean of about 11% disclosure likelihood, while the disclosing firms have about 60%. So it seems that our model captures the disclosure likelihood quite well. And what we do is, for instance, in the market view, where we consider financial market outcomes, we're going to run the following baseline regression, where on the left-hand side, Y is the respective outcome variable of interest. I'll describe them in a second. And on the right-hand side, our coefficient of interest is beta 1, which captures the effect of our disclosure expectation variables here. And we will use the two proxies simultaneously. In addition, we use standard controls variables that are associated with the respective outcome variables. And because we're interested in cross-sectional differences between non-disclosing firms, we're using industry and year-quarter fixed effects. So first analysis is about abnormal returns. The outcome variable are CAR, cumulative abnormal returns, relative to the S&P 500 market index. And we find that there's essentially no significant difference between strategically and routinely withholding firms. So that suggests that strategically withholding CapEx guidance seems not to suggest negative valuation information to market participants. Now you may argue that, okay, Matthias, you're proxying for the market's disclosure expectation by the disclosure prediction model or by the history. Maybe you're not capturing that properly. So what we do is to counter that argument is, well, the literature is very clear about strategic non-disclosure of earnings information, so earnings per share information. So what we do is we use the same procedure, so to construct strategically withholding EPS firms, and therefore we construct EPS disclosure prediction, again, where we have this logit model where we try to predict whether a firm is providing EPS guidance, and we calculate the EPS disclosure history, the history of providing earnings guidance. And as in line with the literature, we find significantly negative effects, where essentially this means that no news is bad news. The market perceives those strategically withholding firms in the earnings space as firms containing bad information, but not in the CapEx space. Then the second question is, okay, maybe because earnings may be more tangible and investors have a higher focus on earnings, maybe they don't realize the strategic withholding of CapEx guidance. However, we find that they take notice, and in particular, we look at conference calls and the interaction of investors with management here. So we're going to use both an indicator, whether there's a CapEx related question in the Q&A section in a conference call, and the log of it, so the number of CapEx related questions in a conference call. And we find that our disclosure expectation proxies that we have are significantly associated with more or higher likelihood of asking CapEx related questions. So investors seem to take notice of the strategic withholding of CapEx guidance here. Now, when it comes to informed trading or the feedback effect in general, informed trading is essentially the channel by how investors, managers could learn, right? If investors trade on their information, so if there's a lot of informed trading, prices may be informative and provide managers with new insights about future investment. So this whole feedback effect is driven by the extent of informed trading. And therefore, our next test will be about how the strategic non-disclosure affects informed trading measures. Now, there are two competing views here. One is what we call a proprietary cost argument. So maybe the non-disclosure decision is driven by a manager's decision to hide strategic information about investment plans. Because of proprietary costs, the firm does not want to give this out to competitors and therefore strategically withholds that information. When we think of a trader's perception now about the strategic withholding, well, because the firm is not disclosing this type of information and rather withholds it, that essentially could relate to a firm entering new markets, entering a new growth phase, let's say. So in general, this should increase the uncertainty of investors, and therefore, whenever there's uncertainty, there is high profitability of informed trading. So this should increase the profitability of informed trading. A second competing view is what we call a signaling channel. Now, if we consider really the incentives of a manager who wants to learn from the market, this manager would, disclose information if it helps him or her to learn from the market, but rather withhold information if it would hurt her. And therefore, if a manager withholds disclosure, the manager may anticipate this would destroy gains from informed trading. And ultimately, because traders are not fooled in equilibrium, they anticipate that the strategic withholding may be exactly driven by the manager's desire not to crowd out, so they perceive the profitability of informed trading to be low, which predicts lower levels of informed trading upon strategic non-disclosure. And what do we find? Well, we're going to use two very standard informed trading measures, stock price non-synchronicity and probability of informed trading. And we find that across both of our disclosure expectation proxies, we find lower levels of informed trading, meaning that strategically withholding firms are associated with less informed trading than routinely withholding firms. So this finding is more in line with what we call the signal down here. Now, as a quick summary of the firm view, of the market view, strategic non-disclosure is not perceived as a negative valuation signal, but investors seem to take note, and we find that there's a negative association with informed trading in the non-disclosing firm stock. Now, the question is, okay, who cares, right? The feedback effect, again, really is about a firm's investment making. So if there's less informed trading, there's potentially less information in prices, so managers have a harder time learning new information from market prices. So the next step, we're going to focus on firms' investment making and how this differs across strategically and routinely withholding firms. And in a nutshell, what we find is that strategically withholding firms learn less from their own price, but use alternative information. In terms of the regression, we use the following specifications. So on the left-hand side, we use either investment or future CapEx spending as our outcome variable. And on the right-hand side, we're interested in beta 3 here, which is the effect of the disclosure expectation on the investment Q sensitivity. So the literature has identified a positive investment Q sensitivity being associated with this feedback effect. High valuations today reflect that the market is positive about the firm's strategic position, and firms react by that by investing more. So that's how investment Q sensitivity in general works. And now the question is whether the investment sensitivity is stronger for strategically or routinely withholding firms. And we find that we find a lower investment Q sensitivity for strategically withholding firms, again being in line with the previous result on informed trading, that strategically withholding firms learn less from their own market price. However, we find that those strategically withholding firms rely more on other information sources, and in particular, we find two effects, which I unfortunately don't have time to go into detail here. We find a higher cash flow investment sensitivity. So it's so there's a literature that highlights that current cash flow is a signal of a firm's future profitability as well, right? If whatever generates cash flow today likely provides cash flow also in the future. So there's a higher cash flow investment, future investment sensitivity, highlighting that the strategically withholding firms rely more on internally generated profitability signals as opposed to routinely withholding ones. And in addition, we find a higher investment peer Q sensitivity. So here we used the average valuation of a focal firm's peers, and we find that the focal firm is more likely to rely on information incorporated in the peers' prices in guiding their future investment making. All right, so of course you may be thinking, and we certainly acknowledge that disclosure decisions are endogenous. So of course, this is not a paper about causal links, because a lot of things are going on behind the scenes where we have no exogenous variation or any shocks to identify causal links. However, what mechanisms may drive our findings? So we first consider the disclosure decision being the trade-off being, a firm disclosing CapEx guidance, generating feedback for the market and making bad investment decision, versus the cost of disclosure, for instance, by proprietary costs. If this is really the trade-off that firms face, then, if alternative information sources become more informative, this leads firms to withhold CapEx guidance more and substitute the feedback benefit with those alternative channels. However, this trade-off essentially abstracts away from the consideration of how disclosure or non-disclosure would affect informed trading. Alternatively, that's related to the signaling channel. Is a disclosure decision driven by a firm's consideration whether it would increase market feedback relative to withholding information in a given quarter? And here the interpretation is that, okay, because non-disclosing firms realize that they will be perceived as strategic by the market, they will learn little, and as a consequence, look to alternative information sources. This kind of reversing the line of the cause and consequence mechanism here. However, that interpretation abstracts away from those alternative information sources affecting disclosure choices. So we think that both mechanisms are in play simultaneously and interact with each other. So we cannot really provide a definitive answer here. So let me conclude. There's recent literature documenting that CapEx guidance is likely to be driven by a new disclosure motive, like market feedback. And in this paper, we consider or focus on the consequences of strategic non-disclosure of this feedback stimulating CapEx guidance. We find no valuation differences between strategically and routinely withholding firms, but we could document that the former have less informed trading. In line with that finding, we find that strategically withholding firms learn less from their own stock price, but rely more on alternative information sources. These findings are largely at odds with classical disclosure theory prediction upon non-disclosure. Essentially, in the big picture, implication is that, well, of course, CapEx guidance is a different thing. It's not driven by a valuation motive by and large. However, one little cool insight, I think, that we show is we identify what we call it an indirect externality. So the voluntary disclosure today, either by myself or by my peers, essentially changes the future interpretation of non-disclosure. So, because if I disclose today, the market will expect me to disclose also tomorrow. However, this will affect the consequence, or will affect informed trading upon non-disclosure in the future, which may lead to worse informed investment making in the future. So therefore, voluntary disclosure, of course, affects firms and competitors directly, but we also show an indirect externality by changing the interpretation of non-disclosure. All right, thanks a lot. I'm very much looking forward to Bryce's comments with one of the papers that we are citing all the time. So thanks, Bryce, for taking up the discussion role, and I look forward to all the other comments as well. Thank you.